Train the muscles, not the joints.
Welcome back to Natural Gallant Bodybuilding, Mountain. And today I'm going to talk to you about what made a major difference in my results after 8 years of training. There's two main factors that made a major difference in my training. But first things first, I want to just say one thing. Some of you guys are messaging me on Patreon or other places and asking me about certain questions about exercises or about range of motion or about workout program splits, you know, all that sort of stuff. What I want to encourage you to do is to go through the playlists on this channel. You just click down there, there's a playlist on all these different subjects, and you can peruse through these videos that are in alignment with some of the questions that you guys are asking. And if you're on a laptop or a desktop computer, you can go on the magnifying glass and search through my channel itself for the individual videos. I noticed on iPhones or iPads or whatever, for some reason it doesn't work that way. Whenever you use the magnifying glass, it just searches through all of YouTube. But if you go on the channel and you use the magnifying glass, you can actually search this channel itself for specific videos depending on what questions you have. I highly encourage you to do that because chances are I've already answered your question in 3 different ways in different videos. So watch all the videos because sometimes I have a different take on the exact same subject because something else comes to mind that I think you might want to consider when making decisions about your training. Mountain. Now the other thing I want to mention is I'm going to talk about 2 things that made a huge difference in my training, but what I want to also talk about before I get to that is that people have a tendency to oversimplify things. They find one thing that works for them today, and then they make blanket statements about this is the most effective way to train. You know, you always hear it, progressive overload is the only way, high intensity is the only way, intermittent fasting is the only, like they come up with these different grandiose sort of ideas based on something that gave them temporary results. But what I'm going to encourage you to do is to think more holistically and to understand that whatever is going to help you is usually what you've been missing in that exact moment, but not necessarily what's good for all instances or all people at all times. You see what I'm saying? It's whatever is the weakest link that you need to address, and that is what's going to give you the biggest gains in this moment. And sometimes that's a nutritional deficiency like I've talked about with minerals like calcium, magnesium, you know, some things that are underestimated, some things that you've overlooked because you've made assumptions about that stuff. Other times it could be a simple training technique or a range of motion or whatever, and all of a sudden you make an adjustment and you get great results. But then you go to somebody else and you say, hey, this is the secret to training. Like I just heard a streamer on YouTube the other day, and he's not a big guy and he's not a fitness guy or anything, has no experience, but he's a young kid. And usually the curse of being a young kid is thinking you know everything after you've had one positive experience in something, right? So he's telling these people that are struggling to lose weight, he says, oh, don't worry about your diet, don't worry about anything, just train more. You know, it's the most horrible advice you could give somebody because there's a lot of factors. Say you get somebody that's 300 or 400 pounds and you get them to train more. Well, sometimes they have a limitation on how much they can train because if you get them to train too much, the joints are taking such a beating, say from walking hills and doing these different types of stuff, sometimes they will break long before they burn enough calories. So if they're not addressing the diet along with the exercise, it's going to be a bit of a disaster, especially if there's any nutritional deficiencies or maybe they're just eating so much food, they're trying to outrun the diet. And I've learned that you can underestimate greatly what people's appetites are. Sometimes they're doing the most destructive things. So that said, try not to oversimplify what's the best possible thing. Just realize there's probably the best possible thing for you in this moment that will make a massive difference. And it's usually something to do with whatever is your weakest link right now that's preventing you from putting on muscle. So of course we know there's nutrition, there's training, and there's rest. It's like a 3-pronged approach to training that needs to be in some sort of balance in order for you to put on muscle. But the big thing I did after 8 years of training that made the biggest difference was that I started, and I know this is gonna be like, duh, right? But I started to pay attention closer to my diet. Now before this, I tried to eat enough protein. I tried to make sure that I had, you know, about 1 gram per pound of body weight of protein and so forth. But what I was doing was eating a lot of other junk. I was eating fat, I was eating carbs, and I wasn't really paying attention to to anything. Sometimes I'd eat junk food, you know, like chips and all this kind of stuff. And once I started to cut out a lot of the extraneous sort of trans polyunsaturated kind of heated type fats, you know, the stuff that's like baked, or a lot of the seed oil type fats, and I started to change my diet more to a lower type fat, not no fat, but a lower type of fat diet. And I started eating regular meals 5 to 6 times a day. I noticed that my body ballooned. It made a huge difference from 1996 to 97, and to 98, I continued to put on muscle because my appetite went up. I was able to eat more protein, and at the same time, I wasn't bogging my system down with too much fat. And that's something that can happen, especially if you're eating starches in your diet. Now, I'm not saying this diet's for everybody, but I am saying that glycogen does play a role in how full and pumped your muscles look, as well as hydration of the muscle, which helps the transport of nutrients in and out. I found this because I've tried the low-fat diets and I've tried the low-carb diets, and I'm gonna tell you there is a difference to what the muscle looks like when you're doing different diets. So, that said, there are other factors, of course, involved in what diet's going to work for you. Some people have insulin sensitivity issues and so forth, and you know, all this sort of stuff. So I'm not telling you to pick one diet or another, but what I am saying is that when I started to cut out the extraneous foods that were not serving my goal, it made a massive difference from in 1 year. Like I put on, you know, a couple pounds of lean mass, which is huge for a 5'8" bodybuilder. It made a big difference in my training. Now, the other thing I did was that I became open to different frequencies of training. Now, I know I've beat this subject to death, but I'm gonna tell you that when you start to understand that volume for the sake of volume, because this is the other thing that drives me nuts. People say, oh yeah, to gain muscle, all it is volume. Well, not really, because you're seeing other people saying all it is intensity. So why are these two groups of people arguing? Well, it's because there's a combination of these two factors that's necessary in order for you to put on muscle. And what that right combination is will depend on you, depend on your diet, depend on your genetics, depend on your training split, all these sorts of things. But one thing that I was very locked into when I first started training was that the body had to recover for 72 hours on every body part, and it was like a commandment. And I stuck to it, and I gained some muscle. But once I started to do higher frequency training, like 2-day splits and whole body workouts, from 1997 to 99, I made massive differences because now the body was more refined into creating muscle mass, perfecting that groove, handling heavier weights, having more intense workouts, but not necessarily longer workouts. So the general tendency out there is that people say, oh, you just work harder and longer. Not necessarily, because sometimes you're just breaking stuff down. Now, I'm not saying that you got to be nervous about overtraining and stuff all the time, but what I am saying is that there's definitely a way of streamlining your efforts instead of just doing set after set after set and then resting 10 days and then coming back to the same body part. You know what I'm saying? Like, I mean, that's an extreme of a bro split, but what I'm trying to say is that when I noticed that my body responded well to frequent reminders, and I call it the callus principle, right? When you lift something every day or every couple days, you notice that you get calluses. If you only do something once a week, a lot of times the calluses don't form and you end up ripping the skin quite a bit. Well, I noticed there's something to do with that also has to do with your training, where you develop a bit of a callus type principle in the body, and that helped me push through the plateau that I was at from the 3-day split and 4-day split type training programs. Now, those are the two major things that made a big difference in my training. Now, the other thing I want to say to you is that these two things have something in common. And what that was that I had to be open to looking at my training from a neutral point of view and not getting too invested or too attached to the previous techniques that work for me, and really be open-minded and experiment with other ways of training or other ways to orient my diet. So this openness of mind, which I've talked about a lot on this channel, it really is important in order for you to evolve, because without a humble mind, there is no chance of evolution when it comes down to what workout program is going to work for you next, because your body's going to throw you some curveballs. And sometimes it's going to say, oh, this is the problem. And you're like, I have no idea what's going on. Everything I've done from the past, it's not working anymore. What do I do now? Well, sometimes your body's trying to teach you something else about it. It's like a conversation that's going on. So anyway, I hope this helps out in your training. Thanks a lot for watching. If you need to get a hold of me, just go to naturalgallantbodybuilding.com, and thanks to the Patreon supporters, and take care for now. Mountain. Natural Gallant.